Phase 5 is nearing its end and players are near achieving their best in slot. With Darkmoon Faire on the horizon, it couldn't be a better time to talk about how to use your powerful AQ40 gear to get parses, and that is exactly what we're going to be doing today. Discussing the strategies to use on every single boss in AQ40 to min-max your way towards getting those 99 parses. Now I would like to put a little notice out there before we get started with this video, and that is that in this video we need to distinguish what is playing optimally and what is playing lucky. Now, technically, the highest DPS ceiling that you're going to be able to achieve on most bosses is just pumping Shadow Bolts and ignoring damage over time effects. Just pumping Shadow Bolts and crossing your fingers, hoping that you get crit after crit after crit after crit. If you cast Shadow Bolts with proper debuffs, power infusion, talisman, etc., and you get crit after crit after crit after crit, you're going to have a higher damage ceiling than what you would have if you did proper play with multi-dotting and those sort of things. However, in this video, we're going to be talking about the proper way to play the boss because it's unrealistic to assume that every single time you go up to a boss to get lucky and get 14, 15, 16 crits in a row. So instead of talking about, hey, go up to this boss, cast Shadow Bolt and hope that you get crits, instead of that, we're going to go over the optimal, the appropriate way to play each boss, in my opinion. Before getting into the bosses, I'm just going to say that there are tank and spank fights in AQ40, as we all know, such as Vanquish, Ouro, and Princess Huhuran, where pretty much all the warlock does is dismount and start pumping damage, and that's the only thing that they need to worry about. Does that mean that there's nothing we can do to improve on those bosses? Not necessarily. That just means that we have to look more in depth into what we're doing to really min-max our damage. So here I'm going to give you two examples of how to effectively utilize your PI and Talisman uptime to get the most damage out of it as possible. And the reason I say these are just two examples and not the best perfect scenario is because it's going to vastly depend on your personal guild's kill time. For example, let's say that you kill a boss like Princess Huhuran in 48 seconds. Well, looking at a fight that is 48 seconds, we know that Corruption is an 18-second damage over time effect. That means if we cast two of them, that's going to take up 36 out of the 48 seconds, leaving 12 seconds left. Does that mean, okay, I need to immediately put my third Corruption up after the second one falls off? Well, that third Corruption is going to miss out on 5 seconds of its damage, aka 1.5 ticks, technically just 1 tick. Is it worth it for me to even use that Corruption? What happens if the boss dies in 45 seconds? Then I miss 2 ticks. Well, once you start to miss 2 ticks on your third Corruption, then it's not really worth it to even go for that Corruption. Which means that you don't necessarily have to align your Corruptions perfectly timed together either, because you're only going to go for 2 Corruptions regardless. And you'll have some extra time during the boss where there's not going to be Corruption up, and that's okay. Well, during those circumstances where you have a little bit of leeway and you don't have to chain your Corruptions perfectly together, those are moments where you can stagger your PI and your Talisman usage to more appropriately align them with your other spells. And you'll get what I'm meaning when I explain this chart in front of us. So first, let's look at if we were to pop our Talisman and PI immediately when we engage into the fight. Now, you'll notice here in the yellow, that is when we have Talisman and PI active. We'll see here at 0 seconds, the very instant the fight starts, let's say we pop Talisman. We apply Corruption immediately, and there's 1 stack of Shadow Weaving on the boss because you assume that your Shadow Priest is applying a stack of Shadow Weaving every global. So at 0 seconds, we pop Talisman, put our Corruption up, and we have 1 times weaving. At 1.5 seconds after the Corruption Global, that's when we can start our first Shadow Bolt cast. At 4 seconds in, we have our first Shadow Bolt cast finishing and starting our second one. And that Shadow Bolt cast is going to finish and hit the boss with 3 stacks of Shadow Weaving. Our second Shadow Bolt comes out at 6.5 seconds in, and that is going to have max Shadow Weaving, and then 9 seconds, and then 11.5 seconds. Now if we look at the 14-second mark, that's when our 5th Shadow Bolt finishes, and we immediately want to Shadow Burn. And that's because our Corruption is not going to be ready to reapply. If we reapply it, we'll clip our timing, but we still have 1 second left of Talisman and PI active, so we want to do something within that 1 second, and using a Shadow Burn with PI and Talisman active is going to be worth it, if you can fit it in appropriately. Now, some people have different MS, different latency, so you might not be getting your 5th Shadow Bolt cast to finish right at the 14-second mark. Maybe it'll be 14.5, maybe you'll be close to 15. But essentially, this leaves very little room for wasted TOEB/PI uptime. Looking at a similar chart, let's say we popped our TOEB at the 4-second mark. And by 4-second mark, I mean we start the fight with Corruption just like normal, start casting Shadow Bolt at 1.5 seconds after the Corruption Global. Our Shadow Bolt finishes casting at the 4-second mark. That's when we pop TOEB and PI. Then we start casting our next Shadow Bolt, and so on and so on and so on, similar to the last setup. What changes here is after our 6th Shadow Bolt cast finishes, we go into a Shadow Burn, and then we reapply Corruption. That way, once again, we're utilizing our PI uptime as much as we possibly can. Now, once again, if we look at the spells that we have under PI and TOEB, we have about the same amount of quote-unquote wasted uptime, but this time we're getting 5 Shadow Bolts, 1 Shadow Burn, and 1 Corruption, just like the last rotation, except we have all of them with ×5 weaving. So if you compare the two, this one is going to give you a little bit more damage. And not only is it going to give you a little bit more damage, but it has about the same quote-unquote wasted TOEB uptime. What is important to note though, is if you're doing this delayed method, your PI'd Corruption, your second Corruption, is going to end about 36.5 seconds into the fight. Now, if your guild is killing the boss that you're single targeting focusing down under 36 seconds, then you don't want to go for this delayed setup. And just to reiterate, like I said before, it is possible to delay your Corruption, not chain it perfectly back to back to back, depending on what your specific guild's kill times are. Okay, so for the first boss, Prophet Skeram, let us first go over our spell priority list. Single target, we want to be casting Shadow Bolt, so if we can cast Shadow Bolt, then we do. But if we don't have enough time to cast a Shadow Bolt, then instead we can cast a Searing Pain to squeeze in a little bit of extra damage on a mob. And if we can't cast Searing Pain because we just don't have enough time before the mob dies or splits, then we cast Shadow Burn or Death Coil. Knowing that spell priority is going to be important towards playing Prophet Skeram the correct way. And the reason that is because, as we all know, Prophet Skeram is a huge pain in the ass for casters, especially if you're in a fast clearing guild. And that is because Prophet Skeram splits every 25% health. And he doesn't actually have that much health to begin with in the first place. So the best thing for us to do on this fight is to get into combat as soon as possible, starting the fight, mounted up, immediately get ourselves in position, which is near the center of the stage, so you have access to all 3 bosses, but you generally speaking will have to hug one of the sides, and then casting Shadow Bolt as much as you can. If you see that the boss is at 79% health or 80% health, and you know that he's going to split at 75% every 25% interval, and you see that the rate that you're killing the boss, there might be a scenario where you can't quite fit another Shadow Bolt in before the boss reaches that 25% interval. So you might be able to squeeze in a Searing Pain and then a Shadow Burn. And if the boss, after a Shadow Bolt finishes, is instead of 80% at 76%, then you can think to yourself, oh, I don't have enough time to squeeze in a Searing Pain before he splits. Instead, I'm going to go straight into Shadow Burn. So it really depends on where the boss's health lies as you're finishing your Shadow Bolt casts. If you finish your Shadow Bolt cast and he's around 6% health above a 25% marker, then you can go for a Searing Pain Shadow Burn. And if you see that you finish a Shadow Bolt and he is 1, 2, or 3% above that 25% marker, then it's probably best to go straight into a Shadow Burn. Another important tip for this boss is always knowing and reacting to which split is the correct mob to target. And what I mean by that is every single time the boss splits, you primarily want to be targeting the real boss if possible. And that's because the real boss always has a higher health pool than its clones, which means you'll have more of an opportunity to cast your higher priority spells, aka Shadow Bolt, which is going to yield you the most damage if you can get it off. A couple important things not to do on this boss fight is, if you're trying to parse, having any sort of curse assignment on this boss fight is going to be a no-go. Yes, I know that you have curse assignments every so often if it's your turn to do Curse of Recklessness or Curse of Elements or whatever the curse is, but every time this boss splits, it wipes your debuffs. So you're going to find yourself cursing over and over and over and over, and you're not going to be able to parse if you have that curse assignment. So again, if you have a curse assignment on this boss, you're most likely not going to get a good parse. Another thing about the debuffs getting wiped is the usage of damage over time effects. It is not that beneficial to be using your damage over time effects here, because again, the debuffs get wiped, which means you're not really using your damage over time effects to their full potential. In fact, they're gaining very, very little value on this fight. One last nifty little quick tip is remember that Prophet Skeram is outside technically, which means if you're playing Demonic Sacrifice, you can have your Demonic Sacrifice buff up and then summon an Infernal since you're outside, mount up and start the fight on your mount with an Infernal for that little bit of extra damage, which is a cool trick. The second boss in AQ40 is the Bug Trio, and before we talk about anything else about spell priority or what we do in the boss fight, we first need to address the AoE fear mechanic that Princess Uash has. Now, typically most guilds focus down Princess Uash first, so you usually only have to deal with 1 or 2 fears depending on how fast your guild clears this boss. Usually, the first fear will happen about 12 seconds after you've engaged the fight and gotten into combat with the Bug Trio. So you'll need to find a way to deal with this fear and bypass it. If you're Alliance, I recommend messaging your priests ahead of time and trying to get a fear ward from them so that you already have one up for this boss. And even better is if you can convince that priest or another priest in your raid to give you a second fear ward. If you're a warlock that has no curse assignment that particular week, has a PI assignment on them, and you're ready to blast, you have Darkmoon Fair, you have all the best assignments that you could possibly have, then you should reach out to your priests and tell them, hey, I don't have a curse assignment, and I do have PI, I'm really trying to parse this week. Could you put a fear ward on me ahead of time? Then after the fear ward Then after the first fear goes out, put a second one on me. Doing this will really, really help you increase your chance to parse on this fight. Eating the fear is not an option if you want to parse here. Alternatively, if you're Horde, then I hope I hope that you picked the right race, not one of those green, ugly little nuggets that you call orcs. You pick the right race and pick undead. If you picked an undead, then you have Will of the Forsaken, which means you have a free get out of the first fear. Hopefully your guild is good enough at this point to kill it before the second fear happens, in which then it becomes a problem, because Tremor Totem, as we all know as Horde players, is not that reliable. So hopefully your guild kills it before the second fear and you picked the correct race. Okay, now we can actually get into what to do in the boss fight. And this is one of the bosses that you are going to utilize multi-dotting. And yes, I know, multi-dotting the other bugs doesn't really help that much, because after you kill a target, the other two targets heal to full. For example, if you dot the other targets and you kill Princess Uash first, then when Princess Uash dies, the other two targets are just going to heal to full and your dot damage isn't going to mean anything. That's all well and true, but this is a parsing video, so even though that damage doesn't mean anything, it makes our dicks bigger, okay? And that's what we're all here for. So this is a boss fight where we are going to be utilizing multi-dots. You want to start off this fight being very, very close to the tank while you're mounted, because you want to be in range of the mobs as soon as possible. That way, as soon as combat starts, you're doing something effective. And what I would do to start off this boss fight is activate your Talisman and activate PI right off the start, and put Curse of Agony first on the second kill target, then put Curse of Agony on the third kill target, then put Corruption on the second kill target, then put Corruption on the third kill target, and then nuke the first kill target. For example, let's say that you're killing Princess Uash first, and then you're killing Kree second. I would put Curse of Agony on Kree, and then I would put Curse of Agony on the third kill target, Corruption on Kree, and then Corruption on the third kill target, then cast Shadow Bolts into Princess Uash. Do not put damage over time effects on Princess Uash, because usually by the time you dismount, pop your Talisman, do 4 different dots, and then start casting a Shadow Bolt, Princess Uash should be low enough health that if you were to Corruption it, or Curse of Agony, or use any sort of damage over time effects, you're most likely not going to get its full effect off before Princess Uash dies. If your guild does kill Princess Uash a bit slower to where you would get a full Corruption off, then yes, you would want to Corruption Princess Uash as well. But it all depends on how fast your guild is killing the primary kill target. Now, let me explain exactly why you want to put Curse of Agony on the second kill target first and not the third kill target first. The reason why you want to put Curse of Agony on the second kill target first is, once again, if you kill Princess Uash or your first kill target very quickly, then you want to have Corruption falling off on the second kill target as soon as possible to free up room for more important debuffs and single target debuffs, the normal debuffs that you guys use on a boss. You're not going to have all of those debuffs listed out when the kill target is Uash. But when the kill target becomes Kree or whatever your second kill target is, then people are going to start applying all of the different debuffs that they need to apply, such as Shadow Weaving, Sunder Armor, etc, etc. And then if you Curse of Agony this mob first, you increase the likelihood of Curse of Agony running its duration and falling off by the time that mob becomes your kill target. After Princess Uash is dead, you want to maintain your damage over time Corruption on your third kill target, your last kill target, while constantly pumping Shadow Bolts into your next kill target, the second kill target. You can reapply your Corruption on the second kill target if you feel that your guild personally kills it slow enough that you get your full Corruption off, or at least 5 out of 6 ticks of the Corruption. But if you feel that your guild kills it before 5 out of 6 ticks of Corruption, then I would bypass putting Corruption on your next kill target, only maintaining it on the last kill target. After the second mob dies, the fight becomes extremely self-explanatory. Then it's just a one-on-one scenario. You pump Shadow Bolts into the last target until he dies, putting up a corruption if you feel that you're gonna get at least 5 out of 6 ticks of the corruption on the target. Otherwise, just pumping Shadow Bolt and executing the mob in your normal fashion by Shadow Bolting into Death Coil into Shadow Burn to execute and finish the mob. Since we're using the multi-dotting method on this fight and we're putting strong dots up that are amplified through Talisman of Imperial Power and Power Infusion, it is possible for us to accidentally rip aggro on one of the second or third kill targets, or even if we're getting lucky with Shadow Bolts on the primary kill target, we might also rip aggro on that. So since this boss dies at a fast enough rate for most guilds, the potion cooldown that you're going to be wanting to use on this boss is going to be a limited invulnerability potion, not a major mana potion. If you do need a little bit of supplemental mana, then I would lean towards using a demonic rune earlier into the fight and still making sure to save your limited invulnerability potion so you can play this boss as aggressive as humanly possible. Now, there's actually one more thing that you can do that guarantees that you get 100 parse on this fight during Darkmoon Fair Week. And that is to subscribe down below. Please subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate the support, you guys. I know there's a lot of you out there that I see commenting on my videos every single time, and I do appreciate those as well. All of the comments really help out with the YouTube algorithm. So please comment, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it a lot, guys. And of course, all subscribers typically get around 5% more crit than those who don't. So really, I'm helping you guys out as well. Alright, so for Battleguard Sartura, it's going to be a bit confrontational, because your guild is most likely going to want you to go for the stun and AoE the adds down type of method, but that is not what's going to give you the top parse. That is not what's going to enable you to reach those 99s and 100s. Instead, we have to play a bit greedy on this boss and not help our guild go for this AoE strategy that I'll be showing you in this clip here. Instead of going for this AoE strategy, what we want to do is stay away from the boss, just max range of corruption, pop our talisman, pop PI, put corruption up, and just single target nuke the boss. That's going to outweigh the damage that we do by AoEing. Technically, that's not going to help your team out as much, but we're here to parse. So we're going to stand off as far away as we can while still being in range of corruption and Shadow Bolt and just nuking the boss. The potion that we're going to be wanting to use on this boss is once again limited invulnerability potion. This boss does not die fast enough that you absolutely need a major mana potion, and what is super important about the limited invulnerability potion is the boss is eventually going to want to spin and start moving towards certain targets. And you as a warlock do not want to move or interrupt your casts for any reason. So this means that as soon as you start casting, you want to stay planted and keep just nuking the boss. So if she ends up coming over to you for any reason, instead of interrupting your cast and running away, you can just pop a limited invulnerability potion, not move at all, and keep nuking into her and wait for the tank to taunt her off you and drag her away. Unfortunately, Vanquish the Unyielding, the next boss, doesn't really have a whole lot of strategy to him, or a whole lot of ways that you can get a leg up on the competition. This boss fight is the epitome of a tank and spank. You literally just stack up on his butt and cast Shadow Bolt. So the only thing that I could recommend here is wait to pop your Talisman and PI until you have about 4 stacks of Shadow Weaving. And the reason I say 4 stacks is by the time you pop your PI and Talisman, then cast your next 2.5 second Shadow Bolt, you'll have your 5th stack of Shadow Weaving up regardless. As for Viscidus, we're gonna skip talking about parsing on this boss completely, Because if we look at the parses currently on the boss, the only way to get a top parse is to super cheese this boss. Most of the guilds out there, and most of the people watching this video, I assume, are using the sapper method, where you AoE down the blobs with sapper or dynamite or other various different methods to get him to 1% health as possible, so you can make the boss extremely quick. And if you're doing this method, you don't really do much damage to the boss. You just wand him till he freezes, and then you end up AoEing the blobs. Now, looking at the top parses, we see that in second place, this warlock had an encounter that was 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Third place had a warlock that had the encounter as 2 minutes 53 seconds. And first place has near 2 minute duration on the fight. This is way longer than the normal scenario for the fight. And if we look into what casts they got during this fight, the second place warlock that had about a 3-minute fight got 45 casts of Shadow Bolt off. 45 casts! This is by no means a normal scenario, and is not even a good strategy for killing the boss at all. They simply stalled out the fight and did this so that people could parse and cheese the boss. It is by no means a good strategy, or a secret strategy, or a valid strategy. Nothing at all. It's just purely cheese. So, we're gonna skip this boss and just leave it at that. Princess Huhuran is another boss that mostly just comes down to luck. There's only a few things as a player that you can actually do to increase your odds of parsing on this boss. And what that is primarily is knowing your positioning before you go into the boss. For this boss, casters and healers usually want to spread out around the boss, and it's going to be very beneficial to have those positions around the boss organized ahead of time. That way, when you mount up and run with the tank up into this boss, you know exactly where you're going to stand relative to the boss, so then you don't have to spend any additional time moving around and trying to get away from other players. You can spend as much time as possible just nuking Shadow Bolts into the boss. Moving on to Twin Emperors, now we have a boss fight that actually requires us to do a multitude of different things to really min-max the fight. First off, I want to say that you want to be moving over to Swiftness Zanza for this fight because move speed matters. In addition to that, it's important to use your potion cooldown here for a speed potion as well, and we'll get into when exactly and why exactly you're going to want to use that. So once again, you really do not want to have a curse assignment for this boss. That way you can really squeeze in as much damage as possible. Also, I'm going to mention that we're going to be talking about a strategy and neglecting our personal threat, because generally speaking, most of the high-end guilds that are not losing their world buffs don't have too much of a threat issue on this fight. Usually, the warlock tanking each boss side generates so much threat in the beginning of the fight, especially if they're doing their job properly, that it's not really going to limit your DPS too much. And there is something that we're going to be doing in this fight that's going to help them out with their threat a little bit as well. So first we Agony, Corruption, and then we go straight into pumping Shadow Bolts. And we keep pumping Shadow Bolts, not reapplying either of our damage over time effects. Because yes, technically reapplying a Corruption after your Corruption has fallen off is going to be a DPS increase under most circumstances, but it can be a bit risky, and you can put the raid at risk of the bosses running towards each other and healing. So let's say you're pumping Shadow Bolts into the boss, no big deal, Shadow Bolt, Shadow Bolt, Shadow Bolt, and it's getting close to when the boss teleports. Now, is it better to run to the other side and wait for the boss to teleport over so you're ready for the boss as soon as it teleports over? Or is it better to stay at this boss and continue casting Shadow Bolts into this boss until he teleports away and then you move? So is it better to wait, or is it better to move early? Well, let's discuss that. First, I'm going to start by saying that, as you all have noticed, the 30-second teleport timer is not a concrete timer. It doesn't mean that the boss is absolutely, for sure, going to teleport after 30 seconds. Instead, it's more of an opening to a window where the boss can teleport. Sometimes the boss can teleport immediately after it's been 30 seconds. Sometimes the boss can teleport after 37, 38, 39 seconds, really delaying the teleport by quite a bit. If we were to run over to the other side of the room before the boss teleports so that we get there early, then if the boss delays its teleport by 6, 7, 8, or 9 seconds, those are multiple Shadow Bolts that you're missing out on, because there's nothing else that you can really do, except for maybe hit a bug while you're waiting for the boss. Instead, let's look at what would happen if we stayed and waited for the boss to teleport instead of trying to move to the other room early. If we stayed and waited for the boss to teleport, then we would have more uptime on Shadow Bolts, except we would be risking that we try to cast a Shadow Bolt and he teleports and it interrupts your cast. Overall though, putting yourself at risk of potentially missing a Shadow Bolt, but getting more Shadow Bolts off in general, is going to be better than moving to the other side of the room ahead of time and putting yourself at risk of missing Shadow Bolt casts there instead. By staying and casting on the boss until he teleports, you're giving yourself more control over what your character does and your character's damage output. And if you keep casting on the boss over and over and over until he finally teleports, then that's when our movement speed items start to come in use. If you stay and wait for the boss to teleport, then the second he teleports, you can pop a swiftness potion instead of a mana potion and immediately zoom to the other side and get there as soon as possible and continue to pump damage. Really cutting down on the amount of downtime that you have where you're not casting Shadow Bolts. Additionally, as you're moving to the other side of the room, you can fill this time of no GCDs by life tapping to replenish your mana, or if you have plenty of mana, you can help kill the enraged bugs by casting a Shadow Burn as you're moving around. Yet another benefit of staying on the boss until he teleports rather than going to the other side too early is if you stay at the boss until he teleports, pop move speed items and then go, you're giving the warlock on the other side a little bit of time to get 1, 2, or 3 Searing Pains off before you approach the boss and start casting your Shadow Bolt on the boss, giving you a bit of a threat cushion as well. When comparing this to moving to the other side early, not only are you potentially losing out on Shadow Bolts if the teleport is delayed, but you're also putting yourself at risk of grabbing threat, because you're going to want to cast on the boss the moment he teleports. And if you get lucky with crits, and your warlock tank does not get lucky with crits or even misses the boss, then you're going to be in a world of trouble. So if you wait for the boss to teleport and then go to the other side of the room, you're bypassing that sort of threat issue, while also giving yourself as much uptime on your damage. Other than that, this boss is rinse and repeat, applying Curse of Agony when you get to the boss, then Corruption, then Shadow Bolting. He teleports, you run to the other side, apply Curse of Agony, apply Corruption, start Shadow Bolting, and so on and so on and so on. And once again, technically spamming Shadow Bolts and getting lucky with crits is going to outweigh the damage of Curse of Agony and Corruption, but we can't always play around being super lucky. In addition to that, if you play more around your dots, then it gives you more predictable threat output and gives your warlock tank a little bit more time to gain that threat barrier and make you more safe. I would also like to say that quite a few warlocks like to use Curse of Doom here as the DPS position, and I do believe that Curse of Doom is better than Curse of Agony for raw damage. However, since teleport timers are oftentimes not correct and not exactly on the 30-second mark, you could potentially open yourself up to awkward Curse of Doom timing, where it triggers its damage early on into the teleport, putting you at a scary amount of threat and throwing you off of what you really want to do. Moving on to Ouro, this is more so a boss that's going to rely on your warlock tank. And if you don't know what I mean by warlock tank, as not all guilds are using this strategy, is having a warlock standing off to the side, spamming Searing Pain to generate huge amounts of threat and not having Blessing of Salvation on or Tranquil Air Totem, and doing that on purpose to draw as much threat as possible and attract the Sandblast mechanic to him. And when Ouro starts to cast Sandblast, this warlock moves out of range and back into range to continue casting. That way, the warlock doesn't actually lose the threat from getting hit by Sandblast. This allows you as a parsing warlock to just completely nuke into the boss without having to worry about any sort of threat drop mechanics, getting sandblasted yourself, or anything like that. If you have a warlock tank that can maintain threat, then this fight really just comes down to, once again, single target tank and spank, where you want to apply corruption and wait till you see about 4 stacks of shadow weaving, then start to activate your Talisman, PI, and just single target nuking the boss, finishing off the boss with a Death Coil Shadow Burn, if the timing windows do allow it. As for potion usage, we want to be using a major mana potion here and a demonic rune to avoid using life tap as much as possible so we can use those GCDs towards more and more shadow bolts. There's nothing here where we actually need greater nature protection or limited invulnerability potion for, because we'd be looking to nuke the boss before any submerges go off or any bugs spawn. And finally, we're to Cthulhu. Now, Cthulhu, as we run into the room, it's going to be very apparent that the best position that you could possibly be in is the position with the least amount of travel. So ideally, we would like to be moving into the room as soon as possible, but not being the first person to eat the I-beams, and then taking one of the nearest positions so we can dismount and start doing damage as soon as possible. Also, being able to nuke down the boss within 1 dark glare is going to greatly increase the damage that you can do in phase 1, particularly if you can do it before the first dark glare ends. That's the most important factor. When dark glare spawns, if you have dark glare facing away from you, then oftentimes if your guild can meet the DPS check, you can opt to not move at all. As soon as you enter the room, you can start casting Shadow Bolt and keep casting until phase 1 is completely finished. Now, that's if Dark Glare ends up spawning on the far side from you. If it ends up spawning close to you, then you're obviously going to lose quite a bit of damage if you have to move due to the Dark Glare coming in your direction. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily just completely ruined, you can't parse. It is going to be a worse situation for you, but you can still do damage while moving. The most important thing is to take the shortest path possible, hugging close to the boss and not taking a very far route on the outside. And additionally, making sure that you're doing something while taking that route and moving. That can include life tapping, refreshing corruption, shadow burning the boss, or even death coiling. You also want to be looking to use your demonic rune and major mana potions as soon as possible. As soon as you're missing enough mana for them to become relevant, then put them on cooldown immediately, because oftentimes you can get away with using 2 potion cooldowns here if you put them on cooldown fast enough. As for PI timings and talisman timings, that all really depends. Technically you could use them in phase 1, but it really depends on if your guild is using Nightfall Axe or not. If your guild has healers, such as paladins or shamans, that have Nightfall Axe, and they're unable to swing the axe in phase 1 because healers need to be spread out, and generally people need to be spread out in stacks of 2, then using PI and Talisman is not going to be as effective as it would be in phase 2 when you get a weakened phase, and all of the healers are able to use Nightfall Axe. Now, if your guild does not have someone using Nightfall Axe, then it doesn't really matter if you go for phase 1 PI and Talisman or phase 2 PI and Talisman, because generally speaking on Darkmoon Fair weeks, most guilds are able to burn the boss within 1 weekend phase regardless. As long as you're keeping all of your world buffs on your raid, then you're most likely going to be able to kill it in 1 weekend phase. So it doesn't really matter if you don't have Nightfall Axe. It doesn't really matter if you use your PI and Talisman in phase 1 or phase 2. However, if you use it in phase 1 upon entering the room, upon dismounting and starting to attack the boss, then that means that you have a chance that your Talisman could be off cooldown by phase 2 weakened phase, depending on how fast the stomach is killed. Now, when talking about phase 2 and the stomach, to get an absolute perfect parse, you are going to need to get lucky here, because ideally, we really want to be in the stomach as a warlock. If you get put in the stomach as a warlock, you will far outweigh the damage that you'll do above ground waiting for a tentacle to spawn and getting maybe 2 shadow bolts off on it. Down in the stomach, you could potentially have Talisman off cooldown, and even if you don't have Talisman off cooldown, you can stay down there for quite a while utilizing your Hellstone or other various ways to heal yourself and multi-dotting both of the tentacles, really getting massive amounts of damage out. And if by chance you have your second potion off cooldown, you can use a greater nature protection potion down in the stomach to keep yourself down there a little bit longer. If you didn't get swallowed down into the stomach, which obviously is the ideal situation, then the best thing you can do up above ground is prioritizing the giant tentacles over the small tentacles, since the giant tentacles will give you the highest chance to be able to get shadow bolts off, which is going to yield the most damage output that you can potentially get, while also trying to execute every mob that you can with shadow burn and sneaking in as much damage as possible. Also, it's important to note that if you are above ground, don't stand on a large cluster of people if you see a large group of people around. Instead, stand nearby them, about 10 meters away. That way you have the least likelihood of being near a giant tentacle spawn and getting knocked back. Well, that's the end of the video, guys. And you may have noticed that I did this video in a different format than I did in the previous Blackwing Lair how to parse video. Let me know if you like this format better, or if you like the other one better. I took a poll on my Discord to see how you guys wanted to see this video, and most people voted to just see boss information. But I'm interested to know what everyone in the YouTube community is wanting as well. Do you like the Blackwing Lair video format that I did better, where I watch a whole VOD review and comment on it here and there during the whole run, going over trash bosses and everything? Or do you like this style better, where it's more laid out PowerPoint format and all the information for each boss is listed in front of you that way? Comment down in the section below and let me know how you guys like it, because that's what really matters to me. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Please subscribe, please hit the like button, really helps me out a lot guys. Also, quite a few of you out there have messaged me and asked, since you haven't been around that much alive, are you still doing coaching? Is that still a thing? And yes, if you guys are interested in coaching, I am still doing it for AQ40 primarily. And if you are interested in it, all you have to do is reach out to me on Discord, send me a private PM on Discord, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Anyways, I'm out of here, guys. That's the end of this video. I will see you next time.